we have the privilege of yet another panel, and I think it's a critically important panel, particularly for MCF and its work, but also for all of us who are thinking about climate change. First Nations people globally are at the front line of the impacts of global warming, whether you're talking about the Inuit or Sami in the Arctic Circle, whether you're talking about the Yanomami or Guarani in Brazil. We heard from Secretary General Henry Puna talking about First Nations people across the Pacific Islands, and of course there are First Nations people across Australia, all of whom, because of a range of obvious and tragic encounters with colonisation, dispossession, immiseration, poverty, health challenges, find that climate change is amplifying concerns and conditions which they already have to deal with. There are significant challenges already there. Having said that, I think it's again important to suggest that there are also some opportunities, and I know that I'm stressing that word a lot today. If we're looking at the extent of land in Australia, which is under Indigenous custodianship and control, a significant proportion of that land offers us the potential for really significant changes in land use, including in terms of bio drawdown, establishing a wholly different sort of carbon economy within Australia. And then there are also changes which can come from being attentive to long-established traditional practices, which clearly were much more sustainable than the ones that we use today. In particular, and I speak because of a project that I'm involved in, as is Michael-Shawn Fletcher, and a book on the Black Summer fires, it's very clear that our attentiveness to Indigenous firestick practices would provide us with a wholly different way of managing the landscape in relation to just that one issue alone. So it's my pleasure to introduce this panel, which is going to be talking about First Nations people, the country, and how country teaches us, and particularly can teach all of us, a great deal more about better living in Australia. In this panel, First Nation scholars and leaders are going to discuss what First Nation leadership looks like, what communities need, and how their voices and interests can be included in, and in fact can participate very powerfully and prominently in the transition. I want to introduce Warwick Padgham, who's going to be the moderator for this panel. Warwick is a Taungurung man and is the program manager of the Indigenous Law and Justice Hub at the Melbourne Law School. In this role, Warwick leads the administrative responsibilities of the hub, ensuring that the hub's vision is realised. Prior to coming to the law school, Warwick was manager of Indigenous student programs at the Melbourne Centre for Indigenous Health, and also, which is also at Melbourne University, overseeing Indigenous graduate research student development. Warwick, over to you.
Thank you. And first, before we kick off with the panel, I'd like to acknowledge country, acknowledge that we're gathering here today on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, acknowledge that these lands have never been ceded. I grew up on this country and still do, and I really want to pay my respects to the custodians and how they treated this land and cared for this land, and I think it's quite pertinent to the panel we've got today. Unfortunately, Uncle Dave Wandon is unable to join us, but we have Lily O'Neill with us today, and I might quickly run through the panel, just quickly introduce each other, and then we'll get started with some questions. Michael-Shawn.
Thanks, Warwick, and thanks, Peter. Yeah, Michael Fletcher, I'm in the School of Geography. I'm a Wiradjuri man. I'd also like to thank or recognise we're on Wurundjeri country, and I've lived on Boonwurrung country or Bunurong country all my life. And I've lived and worked, I think I've been here a very long time now. I think I've been at the university for 20 years. So I've worked on Wurundjeri country for a long time. So I'm a geographer. My research is in landscape change and looking at how country evolves through time in response to various pressures and drivers. The main one in which is cultural burning or Aboriginal management or Aboriginal care, probably more appropriately. So.
Thanks. So I'm Lily O'Neill. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Melbourne Climate Futures. I'm obviously not Uncle Dave, apologies. I live on Warwick's country, Taungurung country in Bright in northeast Victoria, and I also pay my respects to your people, Warwick, and thank the Wurundjeri people for the use of their country. unceded as it is. My background is as a native title lawyer. I come to this through native title agreement making, and the work I'm doing for Melbourne Climate Futures, and indeed for Karrina Nolan, who we'll be hearing from soon, is in relation to clean energy agreement making and carbon repair agreement making. Thank you.
And Karrina, do we have you online?
Hello.
Hi, Karrina.
Hi, am I like the big screen awkwardly sitting next to you? Is that?
No, it's not that bad.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I'm coming to you and would like to acknowledge Larrakia country, this beautiful place in the top end. I'm a descendant of the Yorta Yorta Nation and the Executive Director of Original Power, and our organisation's been around for a few years now, but mostly focused on making sure that our communities can really self-determine what happens on country, but in the context of climate change. And that really looks like making sure people have the resources and capacity to do that. And I think, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is making sure that our mob can really do that well. And I think we're seeing a lot of political pressure on our communities who are on the front line of fossil fuel projects. But the work we're doing on clean energy, if we don't get that right, I think we're going to see our communities under the same kinds of pressure. So great to be with you, and sorry I can't be there in person.
Thanks, Karrina. I might throw to you first, if you don't mind, with a question just following on from that little intro. What assistance do First Nations people need from governments, the corporate sector and universities in order to support their role in the energy transition and climate repair?
Well, we've spent some time thinking about this. So we've just launched the First Nations Clean Energy Network almost a year ago, and we spent sort of 18 months doing roundtables, and we actually spoke with our Canadian brothers and sisters, our kind of counterparts over there, and talked to them around energy security, what the energy transition looked like. And the way that we've now set up the network is it has these three pillars that almost deals with those issues you've just talked about. So one of them is community, and that's really making sure that our communities have energy security. And we did some research actually with ANU that showed, 90% of our communities in remote, particularly who are on kind of prepaid meters, were being cut off really regularly. So that means people can't keep their fridges on, can't keep medicines cool, can't wash the clothes, a whole range of kind of social and health, impacts. So there's this community component of the work we need to do, and also how are we supporting our traditional owners for these large-scale projects. We were sort of hearing from people that the first time they were hearing about large-scale development was often, at the BP or at the kind of the sign up, or as you probably heard in Queensland last week, people heard the announcement in the media rather than actually being consulted from the very design stage of a project. So that's that community work that we're doing. We're working really closely now with government. We're going to roll out a sort of co-design strategy. And so, people will be hearing more from the network in the next 12 months. But that's to make sure that government do policy reform to make sure that we're part of this process, because it's become very clear to us that we haven't been up until recently really part of the kind of decision making around the energy transition. And then the industry component, and I can get into some more detail if need be, but that's pretty critical, because if our industry partners aren't working with us in an equitable way, making sure that we can genuinely benefit, obviously ensuring there's consent from our traditional owners from the outset, we're going to see some of the mistakes of the previous mining boom repeated. So there's a lot of work to do, and we've sort of organised it in that way, and we're building the network to make sure that all of our mob, traditional owners, PBCs, land councils are kind of part of this collective advocacy that we think we're going to need to do pretty hard over the next little while.
Thanks, Karrina. Mike, throw to you. What stands in the way of firestick farming becoming adopted as a mainstream land management tool?
Yeah, thanks, Warwick, and thanks for that, Karrina. It was it's really powerful things you said about involving us in the journey and even the inception of this work. I've been mulling over this for a bit after reading it, Warwick, and there's a lot of things. I think the first is telling the truth. We're on this journey of truth telling, and everyone thinks just about, let's tell the truth about the massacres or the poisonings and all these horrible things, but we have to tell the truth about this country. And the work that I've done, I won't dwell too much on the work that I've done, but without fault across from the top end through to Tasmania, the landscapes of today are very different. And sometimes there's 6 times as much eucalypts in these forests that we have today than there was under Aboriginal management. 6 times. And that's unfathomable, really, if you think about it. And yet we're on this obsession, and I'm a bit of danger here. I might get mobbed by the climate mob here about this, but, there's this obsession with planting trees, and there's this obsession with carbon capture. And what we're doing on this continent, I mean, eucalypts are banned around the world for their flammable properties. And we're allowing eucalypts to just go wild. We've unleashed the beast. We've broken the dam of the irrepressible tide of eucalypts that Aboriginal people fought hard to keep under control because it's not safe, you know. So the other thing we can't do, and I know I really appreciate the contextualization, Peter, because I was coming in with, you know, full head of steam here, that it's about opportunities, that we can't just lump this all on Aboriginal people. I'm not saying you are. We can't, it's just a neo-colonial project, the climate movement, if it says, well, we're only going to value Aboriginal work that benefits climate. We need to be empowered to do what we do no matter what. Yeah, and if there's a climate benefit, so be it. But it shouldn't be the arbiter of whether we've got access to country and get to manage country. So we have to tell the truth there, be empowered to manage country, because we did. You know, the biodiversity we're losing, guess who presided over it? We did, you know. There's not a record, and I've got a couple of students here who've worked on this. In the last few thousand years, there were no catastrophic fires, even in some of the densest forests that get bombed by them all the time. Now we've got them. Guess when they started? The decade after the massacres. This is not our problem, you know. We want to manage country to keep it healthy and keep ourselves healthy. If there's a climate benefit to that, that's fine. The danger here is its obsession with carbon capture through forests, okay, perpetuating an unsafe landscape, but also not allowing us to actually get full custodianship and agency on country. So there's a layer of truth there that needs to be stripped back in the conversation about abandoned tropes of wilderness, abandoned people-free nature, abandoned fortress conservation, all this kind of stuff, and engage appropriately with country. Yeah? And then I think, exactly as Karrina said, we can't just then sail in, and this is what I've actually seen this, it's like, oh, we've got a problem, come and save us, you know, despite the fact that for 200 years we've given you nothing. So sit down. It might take a year. It took me 2 years. I'm a pity Uncle Dave's not here. I work closely with Uncle Dave now. It took me 2 years to build up a relationship where he could trust that even though I've come from this place, you know, and I mean, this building here especially, you know, like with the Women's Hospital and what it did to Aboriginal people, there's this deep distrust here. And it takes time to build relationships. Just because you think the problem's now or yesterday doesn't mean we're going to switch on and suddenly start giving you our knowledge and our efforts. Build the relationships, center our voice, and build from there, and accept that we're not going to always agree with you, but at least start from that premise of truth. If we have an argument, you and I, not that we will, you know, let's just do a wave or something. If we have an argument and we just ignore it and don't reconcile with the truth, that's poisoning that relationship and it'll never get better. We have to tell the truth, and that goes with anything, personal level through to societal level. So I think they're the steps we need to take.
A couple of really strong viewpoints there, and worth, I suppose, consolidating. And I wonder, Lily, if you can give a non-Indigenous perspective as a bit of a response to maybe those two.
Yeah, thanks very much, Warwick. Look, I think it's one of the great ironies of Australia and our land tenure system, the situation we have today. And the situation we have today is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have rights and interests in about 40% of the Australian continent. And those areas of land are some of the best areas for wind and solar production at a large scale and climate repair work. And why do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have rights and interests in this land? Because no one else wanted it. No one else wanted it. And that's the only reason that the native title system and land rights has recognised Aboriginal people as having rights in it. And now all of a sudden, people are just starting to wake up to the idea that actually this land is going to be incredibly valuable in climate repair and in the energy transition. And you just heard from Karrina that there is still the situation where traditional owners are hearing about large-scale clean energy projects for the very first time in the newspaper. I've sat in on an Indigenous land use agreement negotiation where exclusive possession native title land was described by the lawyer for the resource company, renewable energy company, as Crown land. I said, it's not Crown land, it's exclusive possession native title. And he said, same thing really. So there's both an opportunity here, a wonderful opportunity to be listening to people like Michael-Shawn and his research on fires and the difference it can make to the wildfires that are caused by climate, but as Michael-Shawn so eloquently, writes, also caused by the change in fire regimes. But these wildfires also spew massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So where I live in Bright, and I'm sorry, I'm probably taking up on your country, I was up at Mount Buffalo on the weekend, and the top of Mount Buffalo is all burnt still. And I thought it was burnt still from the fires that came through in 2019, 2020, and I took some footage of it. And my husband, who likes fighting fires, said, that's not 2019, 2020, that's 2006. And none of it's regenerated. And none of it's regenerated because alpine areas are not supposed to burn. But Mount Buffalo is also part of the solution because it's about to be handed back. Now, as a lawyer, I think, yes, but the conditions it's handed back to its traditional owners is going to be crucial to what can be done with it, and whether, traditional owners are able to practice these land management techniques that kept the land sustainable, that survived, 125 metres worth of sea rises during 65,000 years. We need to start listening to these things, because it's an opportunity, but we need to start listening to it without doing what we normally do, which is come in and say, oh, that exclusive possession native title is something really useful and we'll call it Crown land, thanks.
I've got a follow-on question for that. I might throw it to you, Michael-Shawn, and maybe Karrina might have a comment on as well. Do you feel like recognition is growing about the central role First Nations people can play in the energy transition, or is this still largely misunderstood?
Karrina, do you want to crack at that? Or?
I mean, sure. And then I'd love to hear what you've got to add. I mean, I think it is, but I think it's not just by accident. Like, I think we've really had to push for that recognition to occur. I mean, it's obviously also in the context of, the amazing work many of our mob have done around the voice and that sort of political leverage, I think that and political kind of moment that's offering us. But if you think about this transition, it has been underway for well more than a decade. We're aware of how many kind of non-Indigenous rooftops have solar, but we can't talk to how many, and we can talk about how many don't, of our own mob have kind of solar and have energy security in our homes. So I think there's a kind of growing desire to include us, but I think it's been pretty slow, and I think we've kind of had to push our way in the door. And I would also probably add that I think this government realises that the scale, we must be kind of central to it. It actually just cannot happen without us. So we're talking about 10,000 kilometres of transmission line. That's going to require considerable consent, education, understanding of, our people and, and landholders to get that through. So I think there's a political window, and I think we're kind of just diving right through it.
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of sort of energy more broadly, I think, it's sometimes run the risk of just tokenism. Hey, we're going to do this. What do you think? Rather than actually engaging in what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I think companies like Karrina's are amazing in centering that voice in a meaningful way, because a lot of it diverges on tokenism. And, one thing about what you were saying about Buffalo, I'm up on the weekend and being invited by Taungurung, so I'm up at a bust your myth that they didn't burn up there, but we'll see how that goes. In terms of burning, I noticed you had Ross Garneau on earlier. Is that right? I don't know if he's still around, but the work that was done in the top end, based on his report in 2000 about carbon farming and fire abatement and that sort of stuff, and that really centred Aboriginal voice, based on the back of some really clever white scientists, people like Jeremy Russell Smith and others, and that's been a real success. Centering voice there in the kind of carbon conversation, not so much clean energy, but still, I've worked with mob up there, and for them, carbon's a co-benefit. For them, it was getting back on country and getting money into community, so they weren't suckling off the teat of the government continually. So there's a different centering here, and framing around the one thing is going to be problematic. And then you set metrics around that one thing, and you get perverse outcomes. And there are some perverse outcomes with the carbon farming in the top end now. Like, it's just all based around carbon, and there's some problems there. And country's not as healthy as it could be, healthier than what it was. And the same thing, we've got the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation rolling it down here. There's a lot of political animosity to this. I mean, I worked a while ago now on a white paper that sought to on a response to a white paper that sought to put out roll the pastoral industry out across the top end even more, which is an abject failure. It loses money, hand over fist, the pastoral industry up there, whereas carbon farming is making money. And I don't know, in my head I've got this just because it doesn't fit what we think Australia is. We think Australia's Hugh Jackman running around the back of a horse herding sheep and cattle or whatever. not Aboriginal people walking around with a fire stick, earning money and doing well for the world. So there's more. There's a conversations that are needed on the political level and societal level. And unless we change societal acceptance of this, I think there's a lot of social science out here who can do this better than me. There's always going to be resistance, and it'll fall down at the whim of any government that comes in and changes. And if you don't tackle that, and it probably starts at education, or people can talk to this better than me, but yeah, I think centering our voice in a meaningful way, but also working on that narrative and how we're communicated to the public, not as problematic, not as drunks, not as petrol sniffers, not as all this stuff that are the things that get the attention in the headlines. Who remembers the last headline? Aboriginal people save fire in Top End, as opposed to Aboriginal molestations, or, we've got to control, what are the narratives that are being purported about us, and nothing's going to change unless we change that. That's just deep-seated racism, really. So, sorry, it's getting a bit heavy.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, look, I'd like to respond to what Michael was just talking about. And Karrina and I have certainly sat in on a few meetings together where, Karrina might have to go and do something else. And we're talking to sort of community stakeholders or whatever. And she leaves, and suddenly, as the non-Aboriginal person in the room, suddenly everyone feels much more comfortable to ask me all sorts of, questions. And they usually all revolve around, but Aboriginal communities are really difficult to deal with. Like we try to call, no one answers our call. And what I always say to that is, well, number one, what you've got to understand is that people own land differently. If you're dealing with one farmer to decide whether or not to put a wind farm on that one farm, that's one landholder. These are communities where there's hundreds of traditional owners who are in a group who are obliged to come together as a community under their traditional law and custom and make a decision. Now, that way of community decision-making over that land is probably far more robust than many non-Aboriginal community decision-making. And I come to that, I apologise, this is a much more controversial thing I'm going to say. I was, for a number of years, on the board of the Collingwood Children's Farm, which I'm sure you all know, and the most difficult community I've ever had to deal with was the garden plotters. They also thought they owned the land communally. They willed it to their children in their wills. It was public land. And so every time, Karrina leaves the phone call and everyone suddenly feels safe to ask their questions of me because I'm not an Aboriginal person, they say, yes, but they're really difficult to deal with, these communities. I'm like, you haven't seen anything yet. You go and deal with the Collingwood Children's Farm garden plotters and tell me you're dealing with a difficult community. The thing about decision-making under traditional law and custom is it has evolved over 65,000 years. Yeah, sure, it takes longer than one single farmer making a decision, but it doesn't take longer than a group of farmers coming together and make a decision. It's a better form of decision-making. So that's what I'd like to add as, the Uncle Dave ring in.
Thank you. We might throw to the audience now, and I'd like to encourage everyone to use the QR codes to upload their questions. But to kick things off from the audience questions, we've got a popular one here. Earlier today, David Caroli mentioned the growing inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in IPCC work. Do you feel your Indigenous knowledge should be included? How? Do you think Indigenous groups around the world would feel the same about their knowledge? Maybe Sean, Michael, Karrina?
Can I handle Karrina?
Go.
No. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. Indigenous local people's knowledge is very place-based. We're concerned with our country and caring for our country. And we have these kinship that you're talking about, making sure that our neighbouring countries, everything goes right. I mean, I tried for 5 years to get my head around kinship structures in the Top End, and I'm nowhere on it. And it's so interwoven and interbedded that you can't actually do anything wrong in anyone's country without severe repercussions. Severe repercussions, and that gives you this reciprocity and obligation and these kinds of things. So I think in terms of sorting out the content of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the global circulation patterns, I think there's a limitation. You can't just sort of roll in and say, yeah, well, this is what we think. But in terms of applying on the ground what will work and what won't work in a responsible way, in terms of making country healthy, in terms of species, in terms of tree cover, in terms of people, then you need that. So it needs to be involved at some point in the discussion, right from the top, because you can't have these decisions made that just fall down, but you can't expect too much of us, or maybe me because I'm somewhat of a climate scientist, but not traditional owners on country, So, and it's not so much the knowledge. I think about this. I show a picture to my students when I'm lecturing, so to take a digression. I show the Leaning Tower of Pisa from two different angles. One it's straight, one it's bent, you know. Whichever way you look at it dictates whether you think there's a problem or not and the kind of solutions you're going to give it, you know. So if you've got this big problem up here and you bring in a different perspective, maybe you'll be illuminated. As long as they're just not there because they're the black tick box, you know, they're actually entering the conversation. So I think, yes, it needs to be in there, but don't expect us to come up with some new circulation model on the, you know, we'll be able to drill it down to country. We'll be able to give you a different understanding of how things might or might not work. So,
Karrina, online, any comments?
Look, I mean, I agree with Michael that there's no one size on this, and everyone needs to be able to determine how, you know, our knowledges are used and shared. But one of the things that's really clear in the work we've been doing around clean energy is that if people took the time to understand that knowledge, obviously, that we have about our country, our waters, our sacred places, and the kinds of developments that we could co-create on our country that were, you know, consent was given for, that were co-designed, etc., they would be completely different kinds of developments. And so we all lose when people don't acknowledge and recognise the depth and breadth and, you know, long history and knowledge that we have. So I think, you know, I don't think we should bottle it and sell it necessarily, but I think, you know, we would be stronger together if people kind of acknowledge that and work with us in that way.
I've got a question here, kind of following from that. What are some of the ways non-Indigenous people can educate themselves about country and land management without overburdening Indigenous people?
It's the classic, this one, isn't it? Do you get asked this every panel, Michael, every panel?
every time. Don't go and hassle elders, you know. But I don't know, like take it. So there's in Wiradjuri, right? There's a philosophy. It's not only a word. Yinjamara, right? And it means slowly and with respect. And Yinjamara underpins everything. That really clashes with of today, you know. And it's just we just need a bit of Yinjamara, you know. Take it easy. Understand things take time. Your learning will come if you're open, you're not pushy, and you're willing to listen, you know. And start, like, I think just start, like, as a kid, I used to read country, you know, like I'd every, you know, the bottles are out. What's that mean, you know? I was starting, you just become more connected and you start to slow down, and then you can have conversations if they're there, but don't expect that we've got this thing, oh, I want to find out about country. What if I pop over the library and get into the country volume, you know? Know about it, you know, like it's not like that. You know, we need to Yinjamara slowly and with respect.
I think the university could take some advice from that. Lily, you got any comments on that as a non-Indigenous scholar in this space?
Look, slowly and with respect. Yeah, I'd agree complete with that. And look, I guess, you know, all us people of non-First Nations extraction in this country, there was probably a light bulb moment for us all when we realised we'd been lied to growing up. And I think that light bulb moment is really important, and remembering that all the time, that what we think we know was probably a lie. And then when, you know, if you want to delve into it, some of the writings on how that lie was constructed and when it was constructed and why it was constructed is really revelatory. And if you come to it with that, you know, it's like taking the pill in the Matrix. If you come to it with that perspective, I think, and then, you know, slowly and with respect, that's what I'd say. Take a class with Marcia Langton. That's what I'd also say.
Can I also just quickly add, we did do, for those in the room who want, you know, hard resources, we did actually develop a training, like a full day kind of training module around climate justice for sort of people working in solidarity with our mob. And we did that with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and SEED many years ago. And the idea was that we trained a bunch of non-Indigenous trainers who then were able to share those resources. So we still have those if that's something that's useful for people. It's very, you know, things to read. But again, that doesn't mean that, okay, you've done your day-long thing and there you go. So I think, of course, slowly and with respect, but happy to share those tools if that's helpful.
Thanks. I've got another follow-on question. It's kind of linked. What are the things happening to transfer Indigenous knowledge to next generations, and also to include knowledge and practices in national level initiatives? Maybe Karrina, have you got any comments on that?
I don't know that I can answer exactly that, but I think one of the things we've been doing is actually a little bit about kind of repairing the damage that's been done around extractive mining and the kind of expectations and aspirations of our traditional owners and our mob. So it's a little bit different, but it's actually like, what does that knowledge need to now look like for us to engage on our own terms and kind of try and come at this new transition and, you know, this whole range of new development and this new industry differently, if that makes sense, which is, you know, for some of our communities, we've just come to expect bad behaviour, you know, like very limited kind of actual jobs or benefits of some of these developments. So actually really changing that mindset to go, it could be possible for us to ask for a whole lot more if we're really clear about what that menu of possible benefits is. How, you know, what does that engagement look like? So we've been writing up these sort of negotiation guidelines based on best practice and based on kind of, yeah, you know, aspirations being more than kind of what we've seen roll out over the last couple of decades. So that's a different kind of take on it, but that's the piece of work we've just been working on.
Michael-Shawn, how might that be applied in kind of the microcosm of the academy, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, more Aboriginal voices, I think, is the start. And at the Indigenous Knowledge Institute, we've got Indigenous Knowledge Fellows. We're limited. We've only got 3, but they're no formal training. But I was actually saying this to students today, like spending time with mob. I was up in Nolan recently and hanging out with some kids and some elders. And the kids are sitting there popping off in 5 different languages. Bang, 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 you know, doing stuff out there that I couldn't imagine my 5 or 6-year-old doing, you know, like there is so much capacity there. But we've got this blinker on, you know, you've got to have a PhD, you've got to have a da-da-da-da-da. So bringing in those different knowledges, and then you get those different perspectives and those kinds of things. But following on from that kind of education, we've got to start teaching truth in schools, you know, like I still see what my kids come home with and I'm like, you know, like it's, have we not moved on? Because schools, let's face it, they're just factories for reproducing our own worldview. You know, they're little epistemology factories, you know. We've got to spike that and get the truth in there, you know, and start telling the truth. And building that from there. So, yeah, I think it's recognizing different voices. And the University of Melbourne's pretty amazing. I did a thing the other day and I collated everything that we're doing, you know, from what you mob are doing through to all across. And we're actually really powerful. But what we're not doing is getting enough non-Western traditional voices into the academy and respecting them and allowing questions and things to be centered in them. I think the academy will benefit massively, you know, so.
Lily, have you got any remarks on that? And maybe even, I'm not sure if you've got children or not, but or you know, younger family members and how you share your work with them.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I do have children. I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And when we were hearing earlier in the day about the floods in Lismore, we had to evacuate several times during the bushfires of 2019, 2020. And the second time we evacuated, my son, who was then 2 years old, evacuated himself. He went missing when we were trying to evacuate. And we found him in his nappy. He'd packed like nappy cream and all this stuff in his bag. And he's on his balance bike halfway down the road. So it certainly drives me as well. It's really interesting. We get a lot of, at my children's daycare, they're very active in trying to teach Doodaroa. I mean, there's a bit of a question about ownership going on there, as I'm sure you know. But I just think it's really important. We have a saying in my family that what do we do with people who think they're better than someone else just because of the colour of their skin? We flush them down the toilet. That's at sort of the level I'm going with my kids. But look, I think it's just constantly just interjecting with, you know, little bits of what you know in a non-aggressive manner, right? So if Peter, you've been emphasising hope, and that's because hope will be what works rather than doom and gloom. And you know, not being aggressive gets people's attention more than being aggressive, which must be really hard. You know, it's a pill that you'd have to swallow all the time. There was that wonderful article by Stan Grant recently about the Queen dying, where he essentially said that you're asking me to be sorry and I'm really not sorry. Yeah.
We might shift tack just a little bit, and Karrina, I might throw to you for this one first. Can you point to a clean energy project that did really well with engaging and benefiting traditional owners?
I'm laughing because this is also one of the questions we get asked a lot. And there's a really amazing group of people who are part of the steering group for the network, actually. And we've made sure that we're all on the same page about this. And the answer is no. Unfortunately, at this stage, there is not one project that we can point to and say they've done all of the right things So we've just developed this best practice principles. There's 10 of them. They're very straightforward, things like respect, think about benefits, consent, cultural heritage, protection of country, etc. But at this point, there isn't a project that we can say they've done all those things, which doesn't mean there won't be. And there's a couple of large-scale projects that we're working really closely with traditional owners and the company to try and get them there. But that's the job ahead, really.
Any comments from the panel?
No, I'm not in the clean energy space, so but I can fully imagine that's spot on. Like, I mean, when are we ever included in anything? So.
And look, I'd like to add as a lawyer, so there's been a lot of press releases from large-scale clean energy companies talking about what a transformational impact they're going to have on the local First Nations community. And to which I always think in my little lawyer head, show me the agreement. Let me read the details before I agree whether or not it's that. And in fact, that's a project that we're just embarking on with Melbourne Climate Futures and with Marcia Langton at the Agreements, Treaties and Negotiated Settlements project, is to ask people to show us their agreements. They're commercial in confidence, often for not very good reasons, just that the lawyers who drafted them always stamp commercial in confidence on them because that's what the mining industry has always done. But we're trying to document what's going on in this space. What are the very specific things that are being done on different people's country in relation to carbon credits, for example, or in relation to clean energy projects. So we're trying to document that.
Great. Another one here. Too often, this conversation is about how we can use Indigenous knowledge. So I'm assuming that's a non-Indigenous perspective. How can rich governments and countries best provide more resources to Indigenous communities to use their own knowledge to reduce risk?
Trust us, bit of trust. It's too often paternalistic or really this oversight. The other thing is there's this belief, and this is a very Western belief, that the solution is money. The government just donated, committed $21 million to cultural burning in Victoria, which when you split it up between all the mobs is much, But anyway, moving on beyond that, it's just like, we'll give you this lump of money. We won't make sure you're set up to work with the infinitesimal bureaucracy that exists in coordinating this money and getting it working. We'll just, and in some ways they're setting up to fail so they can then say, well, you just can't do it anyway. You know what I mean? So then it relies on the mobs who are actually progressed enough and maybe sophisticated enough or, I don't know, colonized enough to be able to hook in. So there's so many strings attached to the money and all this kind of stuff. So it requires actually stripping back, okay, do you need the capacity? How can we do this? How can we alter the funding range? Here's an interesting one. Have you ever tried to employ a traditional owner just to get them into the university? You've got people who are sitting in Utakala or who knows where, and they've got to fill out these ridiculous things online on their, just to get some money to give a lecture. And it's like the bureaucracy. Let's just give them some money, and that just scares people. It's like, whoa, no, we've got to be all this, so that, and that's just right across the board. We do have some sophisticated mob. I mean, your mob, they're really amazing. They're doing great work. You've got people who are in the know, plugged into it, probably due to the proximity of a city and education and those kinds of things. But as soon as you move further away where haven't got that capacity, they're just set up to fail, and this money just sits there and then it's like, oh, well, look what they did with it. Nothing. Look what they, and it's, I don't know if that's gaslighting, but it's wrong, it's not right.
What I also think it encourages is a bit of a chips to the seagull type scenario too, right? Where you've got traditional owner groups kind of fighting amongst for the pittance that are actually out there.
100%, and it seems like big money, but there's a big country, a lot of mob, so it's actually not that much when you think about it. And we spend a lot of money. What I hear about is being spent on the Commonwealth Games coming up, it's in the billions or something, isn't it? It's like, fair enough, I like sport, that's all right. But if you can find the money for that, you can find the money for other things, So I think, yeah, you're right. It's we'll give them enough to make it look like we're doing something, but we won't actually invest in their long-term capacity to develop autonomy and work within the system.
I'll just add that lots of ranger groups are still on have to reapply for their funding every 2 to 3 years. How can you invest in long-term projects if you don't know whether you can still employ people in a couple of years' time?
Karrina, any further comments before I ask another question?
Oh, look, I agree with all of that. Trust us. We know the solutions. It's not always about money, kind of a little bit like get out of our way, listen, all those things, Yeah.
This one might rile a couple of people up. What would you say in response to large corporations that are saying they are making actions such as reports and plans, but have had history of having significant impact on this country?
Well, when you go, Michael.
No, I was going to ask clarification on the question, but if you know what's happening, then go for it.
I was just going to say reports and actions. I mean, it sounds a little flimsy to me. We want to see, real change in real life, don't we? So I think, and I guess I'd probably also add that some of the destruction that's happened to our heritage in the last couple of years has been totally legally sanctioned. So I think we're looking for a lot more than reports from companies to believe that they're actually going to do the right thing, if that's the question.
Well, I think it kind of refers to, a reconciliation action plan, but then what does that company actually do in practice?
Oh, they set up their actions so that the box is ticked. They don't undertake any systemic change whatsoever. One of the reasons we've kind of bailed the rap, so we actually have more freedom to do something that matters. So, this is the problem. You set up this sort of stuff and people are gaming the system straight away. Oh, we've got a black person, bang, tick. We held some cultural awareness workshops, tick. We haven't done anything to change anything, but yeah, I mean, that's a very cynical view. Don't get me wrong. There are a lot of companies and organizations out there doing the right thing, but, there's a lot of gaming the system just for the trademark logo or whatever that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Can I get a lawyer's perspective on that?
On gaming the system. Look, a couple of years ago, I first met with Karrina Nolan, and she seemed to be, talking some sense. And so I was at the ANU at that stage, and a few colleagues just decided to throw our lot in with her and do her work. And I think that's the real role of universities, is to support Aboriginal organisations, work for Aboriginal organisations who are doing really good work. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You look at the charter, the university's charter, and I always do this when I'm hitting the executive or the science faculty uppers. Our charter says the university's purpose, enduring purpose, is to benefit society through the transformative impact of education and research. So if you look just within the science faculty, for example, we have an enrolment of 0.4 of our cohort are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We make 4% of the population. We're of order of magnitude underperforming, as verges on actually discriminating, so we're not actually benefiting all of society. So, we actually have to effect systemic change to be able to do that, and then when people are up in arms about positive discrimination, all these kinds of things, you just have to highlight that, if that's our enduring purpose, this is how we're performing. And across the board, we're not much better. I think it's 1% or something, then, it requires more than just reports and plans,
I'll just add too, because every time you meet, a wonderfully well-functioning Aboriginal organisation who's doing wonderful things, they're always under-resourced and understaffed, and they need experts to just jump in and do a few jobs. Always. Can always do with more help.
Next question. Now, this might be a bit contentious as well. Do you believe there is a narrative of romanticising the past? It's often around the world that Indigenous people were sustainable. But what we see is extinction events wherever humans go. Humans once in a place changed the land for human needs.
Oh, can I do this one?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, you're not right. And this is, all of this is based on the fact that there's this myth in modern society that we are somehow separate from the world around us. This nature-culture divide that is direct descendant of the Enlightenment period and the prioritization of science over other ways of knowing, right? Of course we alter the world, Of course we've caused extinctions. That's a complete myth that Aboriginal people made the megafauna extinct on this continent. Complete myth. But it's like the Cheshire Cat's grin, like in Alice in Wonderland, the cat smiles, the body disappears, the grin remains. No matter how much you unpack that evidence, the grin is there and you're fighting that grin the whole time, even though it's not substantiated, right? But it's a fact that we did not do that, right? But sure, we've made things go extinct. Humans do that. That's a part of humanity. And you'll never hear me say the word sustainable. We all humans care for, there's 3 reasons you manage country or you care for country: create a safe, predictable and resource-rich world around you. It just so happens that method was applied for 65,000 years on this continent, right? All of the biodiversity that we've got there developed under that, or at least was sustained under that. And we're losing it now. And it began in 1790, and the fastest rate of biodiversity loss occurred prior to climate change. is because that method changed and a different method was put in, right? So you can kind of trivialize the contemporary by going into the past and say, all humans are bad. Well, that gets you nowhere, and no one's trying to romanticize the past. I'm not saying let's all strip our clothes off, whack a loincloth and grab a fire stick. No, I'm saying, but by ignoring this enormous reservoir of knowledge and practice and skill as we move forward, you're just going to set yourself up for failure and continue down the same silly path. Yeah. We're not asking to take over and rewind the clock. We're asking for a seat at the table and voice. Yeah. So it's actually a really insulting question to say, well, people have made things extinct in the past. That's just ridiculous. And it's actually predicated on it's assuming that somehow that we're the same but different. It's like, of course we are a part of the system. The whole notion of ecological footprint, of course we've got a footprint. We're in the system. We're a part of it. So we have to embrace that and tread in an appropriate way, not remove our footprint, because removing our footprint now is just causing a lot of problems, catastrophic fires, all this sort of stuff. Going too hard with not only a footprint with a crane and a shovel and all this sort of stuff is destroying country. And we're forgetting this middle ground of appropriate care and engagement. That's where I'd go with that one.
I don't think I have anything to add. Look, I'll just add just one thing, which is to say that this idea of country, which I have like about this much understanding of, I feel like when country underpins an entire philosophy and caring for country underpins an entire philosophy, it must be better for the environment than a philosophy in which capitalism and, producing goods underpins it.
Yeah, and that's spot on, and that's why I'm wrestling. I constantly fall into it. The word management, right? Yeah. Management is a master-servant relationship, right? Yeah. Whereas, do you when you have a sick family member or something like that, do you manage them or do you care for them? You care. Why don't we take this? It's not a new spiritual new age thing. It's just positioning ourselves in a different way. Yeah. So it's.
What do you see as the main pathways to mainstream Indigenous knowledge? I'm not sure if that's a thing, but anyway, specifically about country. Could connecting people with country and taking them on land play a role?
Yeah, I'll do a real quick one. This is the caricature I have in my head. I think it's ridiculous. We take our kids, right, put them in a room, and then teach them about the outside world. And then we produce little disconnected bodies running around. Why don't we just go out there and connect? Why isn't half our schooling, if not more, out on country? And out on country doesn't mean taking a plane and flying to, I don't know, Pitjantjatjara country or something. It means going outside and getting your feet in the soil and looking at things. And, we go out with my little preppy and we count leaves, add up leaves. That's connecting. We've got to stop this, and it's segmentalism, like separating the world. So it's, I think that's connecting, and it's not this mythical Northwest Europe, right, where all this stemmed from. Prior, I think, to really the evolution of religion and this sort of separation, they were pagans, weren't they? They were naturalistic religions. It's common everywhere. We have to start reconnecting, and it's not just a special Aboriginal thing. It is here on our country. Don't get me wrong, this is our country. Well, not my country's elsewhere, but people can connect no matter what. And it doesn't have to be out there. It can be out here. So.
Coming from a non-scientist kind of perspective, one of the ways in which I try and do it is to think that we don't have the traditional 4 seasons here. We've got, 6 or 7, and, how many times we're like, well, God, this winter's lasting a bit longer, or, November's a bit different from January. Well, it is.
Yeah. Summer's late. Summer's late because you've got the Gregorian calendar, which you can't even get right because you've got to shift it every 4 years, So it's like, yeah, you're right. Yeah. And that's you hit upon something really, you're just going to get me started. You hit upon something really important here, is this is a variable place, right? There's variability in Europe, but it's a relatively predictable climate. You've got some North Atlantic oscillation, all this sort of stuff that, David can talk to and all this. But we have these weird and wacky 5 years of flood, and it goes all over the place, right? So by fixing things in time, you set yourself up for problems, but by reading country, by understanding what's happening, it doesn't matter if summer doesn't arrive on December 1 or whatever it is, and this is not happening here. It's much more flexible and it's more appropriate, a way of understanding. So in many ways, where writing stuff down fixes us in and gives us inflexibility. So yeah, you're right there.
Karrina, anything to add on that?
Oh, look, you guys are just smashing it there, backing it all in. I mean, I guess I would just add that I think this disconnection to country is what's enabling such destruction of, so many of our sacred places right across this nation. And if you think about the kind of expansion of fossil fuels, that disconnection is, enabling us to continue. And I think it's also meant that for non-Indigenous people, the changing climate has been a shock, whereas our mob have been tracking that, and our connection has mean we've been able to see that coming and be able to, articulate what that looks like in each different place.
We've got roughly 8 minutes or so left, and I might quickly throw this question out there and then we'll have some closing remarks. In what ways do Western ideas and frameworks of environmentalism align with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concepts of caring for country, and in what ways are they anti-ethical?
Surely Michael's on a roll there.
Well, I feel like I'm talking too much. Do you want to have a little crack, or do you want me to?
No, go. I'm too controversial on this topic.
I think they're nothing alike. I really don't. I think that, well, and don't get me wrong, tarring everyone with a one brush here, but I see modern society sitting at the two ends of a spectrum. There's the narcissistic, exploitative, dysfunctional relationship, and there's a misanthropic, kind of wilderness-inspired, lock it up and turn your back on it, neglect narrative. And we're sitting at the two ends of the spectrum. You can see how it works. So repelled by this that you go over here, and we're missing this whole middle of appropriate care and appropriate connection and being involved. I go to Europe. I talk about Europe all the time, but hey, this is where this came from. They don't have wilderness. I did a little search the other day. 2% or something of Europe is, and it's probably, I don't know, Romania or Transylvania or something, that everyone's got myths about, but they don't have the notion of wilderness. They've got their forests that they've engaged with for millennia. They've got their groves. They've got their this, that. They've still got wolves running around. They've still got this running around. They don't call their forest wilderness. They don't perceive it that way. They see it as all a part of their economic strategy and country, So I think that while they may cross, the underpinning philosophy of them is miles apart.
I just want to add something about, I agree. I think there's something that's been going on, though, for our communities that means we haven't really been able to genuinely self-determine what happens on our country. And so, sometimes the environmental agenda is useful if they align, but I think it's a great travesty that we're often backed into a corner just to see economic development happen for our nation. That's meant we've had very limited choices, which is one of the reasons we've been pushing so hard on the clean energy front to try and say this could actually be sustainable economic development. But so often this idea of us being able to kind of really care for our country, but also utilise it in a way that works for us has been really kind of squashed into, okay, actually you just presented with this thing, or else there's no jobs and there's nothing else, we're going to take your kind of land anyway. So I think it's also quite constrained, that conversation. And it's, longer yarn to be had, I think.
We've just got a few minutes left. I was wanting to throw to the panel, each of you. What's the one thing you'd like the audience to take away from this little chat?
I'll go back to, trust traditional owners that they know what to do on their country. And we heard Ross Garnaut talk earlier today about the Treaty of Versailles and how Billy Hughes managed to heroically get racial equality not recognised at the Treaty of Versailles. I always think about a Radio National program I heard about the soldier settlement land scheme after the First World War, and how they gave all this land out to soldiers who'd returned from the trenches and said, farm it and you can all become farmers. But they put so many caveats on these projects, and they tied everyone's hands together and their feet together. And then they said, these soldiers all failed. They failed to turn into farmers. And any analysis showed that their hands were so tied that they couldn't even pick up that shovel. And that's my research area is looking into negotiations between traditional owners and resource companies. And the traditional owners that do well are the ones who are able to give full flight to their power. And the ones who aren't able to do well, the ones where companies like Santos, big surprise, they're in the courts at the moment, They boasted to me. We put all the traditional owners on a minibus and we drove them around and we said, you can have that lot and you can have that lot and you can have that lot. And that's what the Native Title Act says, they say. Now, that's not what the Native Title Act says. But so there's a real discrepancy between the two. So I think, trust them. That's what I'd say.
Karrina, do you want to have a go or do you want me to go?
Sure. Look, I think listen to us. We don't all speak with one voice. Don't expect us to. We have different opinions. I think backing us in though, because having said that, I think for the most part, our mob know the solutions to our issues and we just need the backing to actually implement them. And so I think it's just that idea of working in partnership with us rather than kind of getting out in front. And highlighting that. I just feel like, one of the things that we're going to need, particularly around the voice, is for people to kind of listen and then get on board. You know what I mean? And we're not all going to have the same view about what that looks like, but we're going to need people to back it in.
Well, with the risk of being different, I'm just going to say that too. Yeah, let's just trust Aboriginal people. I think Victor Stephenson put it really well in one thing I heard him talking about. It says, we've been either standing on the outside of the car or in the back seat for too long. Just give us the steering wheel for a while. Let us determine where we go. And I think that's just what you've got to do.
We've still got a couple minutes left. I don't want to finish early.
Oh, there's a hand wave.
Put this on the internet, but I'm very curious about got a very big warning about eucalyptus trees. Many of us are trying to grow trees in rural areas, etc. It's not eucalyptus trees. Which I'd love to grab.
Yeah, great. I often.
Can we maybe just repeat the question for anyone?
Oh, sorry. So the person asking the question asked, in reference to my unleashing the beast of eucalypt, if we want to plant trees, what might be more appropriate to plant if not a eucalypt? And I actually got a bit carried away the other day in a lecture and picked up, those sticks that are pointing around and used it as a guitar and sang that song, give me a home among the gum trees. What a stupid idea. Seriously, how dangerous is that? How dangerous? So I would, if you could, and there's a capacity to either talk to Aboriginal people or look at ethno-historical reports, or, if there's a wetland, we can come and, have a look at what's going on. But I'd say the option is don't plant trees, make it more grassy. I mean, this place, without a fault, was described by the early settlers when they came as open country. We have an obsession with trees. And I get it. They're beautiful, and I love a eucalypt. They're my favorite tree. I think they're amazing. But too many is a bad thing. I love chocolate as well. And, too much is a bad thing. So I think if you want to, there's a whole bunch. There's actually on the website of the DELP, there's a list of flame retardant plants you can have a look at. I can't call them off the top. A lot of them are salt bushes, which you don't want. But there's some other plants there. Casuarinas that can be flammable, but they generally resist fires. But I think maybe we need to move away from the notion that more trees is a good thing. And I even down to the bit where, this has nothing to do with the question, but it's in my head now. When you're driving on a freeway or whatever, and you see those mowers and they're driving around mowing in the middle of the thing and they get to a tree and then there's big birth because they can't get in there. Why aren't we burning that? Why aren't we managing that in an appropriate way? It'll get to every little bit. Why are we using lawnmowers in these areas? You go to Darwin, never seen them burning the nature strips in Darwin. It's awesome. So maybe try and get something that actually looks like, it's up to you. It's your choice. It's your country, not your country, but you're living in it now, to create what you want. But if you want something that's more reflective and sustainable, then just have less trees, or plant something like Pittosporum or some of the, if they grow there, there's some of these less flammable things. But I'd go for less trees. I think we've got too many. Sorry for the carbon capturers.
Time's up. I'm wondering if the audience could say thanks to our panel.
Thanks, Karrina.
Thanks, Karrina.
Thanks.
Thank you to all. I don't know about you. I may find these sessions extraordinarily generous, extraordinarily humbling, and extraordinarily challenging. And all the comments about respect, about recognition, about voice, and about truth, I think are incredibly important ones. And also the position of the university as being a supporter rather than as a attempting to be a leader in places where it shouldn't. Thank you very much.